Welcome back to Keen Reads, and welcome to the final part of my bookshelf tour. Today we'll be going over my final shelf here, which is kind of some miscellaneous books. We start with finishing up my fiction, going into like literary criticism and theory, poetry, science, theology, some running books that I've read and reread a lot, and some other miscellaneous things. So let's get started by looking at what's on top. We have my stack of bookmarks. A coffee mug with some pens in it, a little sloth, my boutonniere. I believe this is from my wedding. I should know that, but it's from something. And then I have this little vial of fake capsules, and I got this as a gift for my residency preceptors when I finished residency, and they wrote little notes on each one and wrapped them up and rolled them in there. So every once in a while I'll go through these, and it's kind of encouraging. But getting started with the books, we have, I'll probably just note which ones I've read, because there's a lot of on this shelf that I have not read, especially in like the theory and criticism. I kind of just accumulate it, and then I'll probably read it eventually. Maybe I won't read that, but I'll just point out what I've read. So we have Dave Eggers' A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, both of which I have read. The Art of Fielding by Chad Auerbach, which I've read. I've actually read most of this top shelf. So for this top shelf, I'll just point out what I haven't read. So Everything is Illuminated by Jonathan Safran Foer. Really wasn't a fan of this book. Kind of a collection of poets, like little snippets and photographs. So this is I Wrote This For You by Ian S. Thomas. It just has a collection of photographs with little, not really poems, but just kind of statements and things like that. It was all right. One of my favorite books, and a book I tend to give as gifts, is The Opposite of Loneliness, Essays and Stories by Marina Keegan. This is probably one of my favorite books. I've read it probably 3 or 4 times in the last couple of years. Outline by Rachel Cusk. Tried to read some more modern novels, and I saw this at the top of a lot of lists, but I really wasn't that impressed with it. The Innovators by Walter Isaacson. This is the only Walter Isaacson that I've read, I believe. Yes. I think I had the Steve Jobs biography, but I didn't end up reading it. The Philadelphia Chromosome by Jessica Wapner. So this is about a certain type of leukemia that I end up treating a lot. The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee. So this is a kind of a biography of cancer. It says it right there. A biography of cancer. Really interesting book. Would highly recommend it. I Am Malala. Read this in college, I think. This is a large print version, so that's why it's so big. An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jamison. This is kind of a memoir written by, I believe she's a psychiatrist, who also has bipolar disorder. Now we're going into my memoir / biography, autobiography thing. So we have Just Kids by Patti Smith. This was really well written as well. All right. Something Urgent I Have to Tell You. This is an autobiography of, no, a biography of William Carlos Williams by Herbert Leibowitz. Wasn't my favorite biography. I liked this one a lot more. So this is I Celebrate Myself, The Somewhat Private Life of Allen Ginsberg by Bill Morgan. Everyone Was So Young by Amanda Vale, and this is kind of a biography of the lost generation of the 1920s. Marked this up a lot more than I thought I did. I think this is the only book on this shelf that I haven't read. I got this secondhand, but it's a biography of Matthew Arnold by Park Honan. I must have got this when I lived in Texas because it's from Galveston. And then kind of a biography of Salinger by David Shields and Shane Salerno. I'll just do the next shelf while we're here. I have another Totoro from My Neighbor Totoro. We have J.D. Salinger's The Last Interview. These are some of my favorite books. So they're the collection of the Paris Review interviews, so volumes 1 through 4. Really enjoyed reading through these. I think I read them all last year. Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. I've kind of flipped through this and read bits and parts, but obviously I'm not going to read this whole thing straight through. Classical Literary Criticism with Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus. I really enjoyed this when I read it. Yeah. Next we go into a lot of books that I haven't read, but I've just kind of accumulated because who knows, I might read them one day. So we have Michael Foucault. This is the Foucault Reader. I have no idea how you say his last name, so I apologize if I just butchered it. Derrida of Grammatology. I've heard this book is incomprehensible, so we'll see if I ever read it. And then we have a Derrida Reader. Figures of Literary Discourse by Gerard Genet. So I thought this was a book by Roman Jacobson, but I'm pretty sure it's actually someone's like PhD dissertation about Roman Jacobson's Science of Language by Linda Arroy. I could be incorrect. It could be an original work by Roman Jacobson, but here's this. Next we have my Roland Barthes. I've read all of him that I have. So we have Mythologies, The Pleasure of the Text, Elements of Semiology, and then S and Z. And then just because I already pulled it out, we have Introduction to a very short Introduction to Literary Theory. Actually, now that I think about it, I've read, I think, the rest of this shelf. So we have Terry Eagleton's Introduction to Literary Theory. This book was very interesting, kind of like a foundational text for theory. Beginning Theory by Peter Berry. The Western Canon by Harold Bloom. Some books about books. So we have How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Forster. Had to read this for my AP language class, or AP literature class, I think. And then What to Read and Why by Francine Prose. This is actually how I heard about Isaac Babel. The Best American Essays from 2022. My wife bought me this when she was visiting New York City at the end of 2022. Two books that I found on Reddit, one of which I've read. So I've read Professing Literature and Institutional History. So this was a history of kind of how English and literature has been taught, specifically English literature, has been taught over the last kind of 200 or so years. And then Professing Criticism, which is an essay on the organization of literary study. Have not read this one. And then Canons and Contexts by Paul Lauder, which I just read last year. This is kind of a collection of his essays and things on the canon, inclusion in the canon, things along those lines, other controversies. All right, moving down to my next two rows, we continue with literary theory, things like that, criticism, essays, poetry. So we start with Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human by Harold Bloom. I like to go over this whenever I read a Shakespeare play and just kind of see what his thoughts were on it. Same with the history of the Western canon. Whenever I read something that he references in here, I like to go back and see what he had to say about it. Literary Essays of Ezra Pound. Have not read anything by Ezra Pound. Two kind of histories of philosophy, both of which I've read. I really do like reading these kind of like broad strokes histories of, I guess, Western thought. In fact, this is literally called The Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas. I read this first for a class, and then Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which I read just for fun. I've heard that he's kind of biased in this, but I don't know enough about philosophy to be able to pick up on that. Another author I've not read nothing of is Gertrude Stein, The Language That Rises. Vladimir Nabokov's lectures on Russian literature. I have read selected essays in here. I've read essays on the books that I have read. So if I've read a book that he references in here, I then have read the associated essay. Umberto Eco on literature. Have not read this. This Is Not a Pipe by Michael Foucault. I have read this. Some books I've showed in some earlier videos, which is my companion pieces to Ulysses, which is the new Bloomsday book, and then Allusions in Ulysses. Have not read this, but this is the first series of Essays in Criticism by Matthew Arnold. Two reference books, both of which I've read. So Edith Hamilton's Mythology, which is kind of a classic, and then Myths and Motifs in Literature. Motifs. Harold Bloom's The Best Poems of the English Language, from Chaucer through Robert Frost. I've read a lot of this, just I haven't read it all straight through. Same goes for this next book, which is the Oxford Book of English Verse. Kind of a cool little copy I got from a secondhand bookstore when I lived in Ohio still. Our Underachieving Colleges by Derek Bach. I believe he was a president of Harvard or something at Harvard. But this is kind of how our colleges have progressed from being centers of learning and learning how to think, and now kind of being diploma mills and places where you have to go to get your practical training rather than how to really think and things like that. Ending this section, before we go into my running section, we have Amusing Ourselves to Death, and Beyond Bumper Sticker Ethics, both of which I had to read in an ethics class in college. Actually, this might have been more of a politics class or something like that. Then we go into the real book that I've actually read more than any other book. So I've been saying this whole time that I've read 100 Years of Solitude more than any other book, but it's definitely Once a Runner by John L. Parker. If anyone has ever been a runner, you know what this book is. I read this book before every single track season in high school and college, so that's 9 times just there. And then I've read it still a handful of times even when I haven't been really running. And recently I've been getting back into running, so I'm probably going to pick it back up again in the next week or so, honestly. I've been getting the itch to reread it. So Once a Runner, which is just a generational text. I have the sequel here and the prequel, Again to Carthage, Racing and Racing in the Rain, both of which I've read. We have 14 Minutes, which is a memoir by Alberto Salazar, who's a famous marathoner and running coach, now kind of disgraced. The Runner's Rulebook by Mark Remy. This is kind of a humorous take on running. I also have The Runner's Field Manual, which is pretty much the same book, just extended. Another book that I've read a ton of times, at least 8 times, is Running with the Buffalo. So I used to read this before every single cross-country season. This is someone who follows a year of the Colorado University's cross-country team. More books that I've reread. I went through a phase when I was in high school and college where I would just read these running books over and over again. Because it really felt like I could relate to what I was doing in my life of just constantly going out running and then the next day doing it all over again. So this is Sub 4, Alan Webb and the Quest for the Fastest Mile by Chris Lear, same author of Running with the Buffaloes. This was the first running book that I bought myself. I remember buying it when it first came out. I saw it advertised in the Running World magazine, and I was like, I gotta pick this up. Bowerman and the Men of Oregon. I was probably early high school, maybe middle school when this came out. I distinctly remember reading it, getting it from the bookstore, and then my dad stopping for gas afterwards and just turning on the light in the car and reading it there, because I just had to start reading it. Duel in the Sun by John Brandt. This is about, I think, the 1982 Boston Marathon, which was kind of a battle between two American runners, one of them being Alberto Salazar, who we talked about earlier with this 14 Minutes book. So then we have those two books I already showed you. The Quotable Runner, which is just a collection of quotes about running. Very motivational, if anyone's looking for it. And that's the end of my running section, kind of. I guess we have a kind of a transition text. So The Courage to Run, Jim Ryan, an inspiration for winning the race of your life. This is Jim Ryan was the first U.S. high schooler to break 4 minutes in the mile and was the U.S.'s best miler for a long time. Some might argue probably might still be the best, just given the fact that he was running on cinder tracks with really crappy soles or shoes and things like that. But this is kind of a running book and a devotional book. So I'm a Christian, so we have some theology and Christian books that I read in college. Coming up next, The Prodigal God, Recovering the Heart of the Christian Faith. The Cell's Design, I cannot remember what this is about. I know I had to read it in college, but I can't remember. Not a book about theology or anything, just The Birds of Ohio. I got this when I was younger when we went hiking, and I was allowed to pick out one thing from the state park's gift shop, and I bought a book about Ohio birds. The Book of Mormon. I'm not a Mormon, but I thought it was interesting to read about. I think I've read all of these, by the way. The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris. Obviously not a Christian. He is a kind of a new atheist talking about faith or anti-faith, things along those lines. But I think he's interesting, at least to read. Again, not a Christian book, but The End of Faith by Sam Harris. Revolution in World Missions by K.M. Yohanan. The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer. We have one of my favorite authors is Preston Sprinkle. So he is a Greek scholar, and he kind of just takes certain ideas. So in this one, it was pacifism or nonviolence. This one, it was grace. And this one, it was homosexuality. And really just tries to take a clean slate to his mind and read the actual texts of the manuscripts of the Bible and see what, without bringing in his presuppositions, what he's learned in the church throughout his whole life, and just tries to see what the Bible actually says about these topics. The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. The Good and the Beautiful God, just something I went through with a small group at church last summer. Some college books, so How to Understand the Bible. The Apocrypha. Lost Letters of Pergamum. Crazy Love by Francis Chan, and then Humility by C.J. Mahoney. Finishing off my theology section here, we have Rendering Unto God and Caesar, which is kind of a collection of foundational U.S. documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers are in here, as well as some commentary from some Christian thinkers, I guess. Don't Waste Your Life by John Piper. Think by John Piper. And then Blue Like Jazz by Donald Miller. The Deep Things of God by Fred Sanders. Here we have Bible Doctrine, which is a book of theology by Wayne Grudem. And then maybe more history than theology is the complete works of Josephus, which I have not read. I haven't read any Josephus, but he's kind of an intra-testamental historian. So kind of documenting the time in between the Old and New Testaments. A book I use quite often is Antibiotics Simplified. I am a pharmacist who treats patients that are immunocompromised, so I need to know a lot about antibiotics and infections. Then we go into the last section of my bookshelves, which is kind of an overflow. So these are books that I've recently acquired that I have not yet placed in the theology, or in the correct section of my library. So we have the complete works of Primo Levi here. The Rape of the Lock and Other Major Writings by Alexander Pope. I have read this. Ravelstein by Saul Bellow. Read this at the end of last year. I've liked pretty much all of the Saul Bellow I've read. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Was kind of enthralled by this. Was surprised at how much of a page-turner it was. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Was kind of let down by this. Not that it wasn't good, but I think I just had too high of expectations for it from how everyone talks about it. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I just did not get this novel. I didn't think it was funny. Really had to drag myself through it. Come to the Slumberless Land of Nod by Tracy Brimhall. So this is a poetry collection. It actually has my favorite poem in it, which is Fledgling by Tracy Brimhall. More Saul Bellow, what is Mr. Sandler's Planet? I have read that. And these last two books I have not read here yet. So What is Art by Leo Tolstoy? And then the only Dickens I own, which is Hard Times. The only Dickens I've actually read is Great Expectations, which I read for a class in high school. Going to the bottom shelf here to finish off my bookshelf. We have the Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. I have the second one, which we talked about in my very first video. A Sentimental Journey and Other Writings by Lawrence Stern, as well as The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, by the same author. Not read that. I don't think I've read anything on this shelf, actually. So we have The Death of Ivan Ilyich and Other Stories by Leo Tolstoy. The Poetic Edda. The Prose Edda. Pensies by Blaise Pascal. The only Murakami that I have, which is Kafka on the Shore. I have not read any Murakami. A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. The only Nietzsche I have, which is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Native Son by Richard Wright. And then V by Thomas Pynchon. Just getting these out of the way. Then we have my program from the Ohio State-Michigan game this year. This was a gift for my 30th birthday. The tickets to the game were by my wife. We ended up losing, but we won the national championship, so it's okay. Marvel's Masterworks, which is a collection of comics. My uncle worked at the company, I guess the factory or something that made these, printed these. Publisher, maybe? So he got me a copy. Ghibliothek. I'm not sure how to say that, but I really like the Studio Ghibli movies, as you can probably see from the Spirited Away poster and all the Totoros around. It's All Worth Living For by Levi the Poet. This is a book by my favorite spoken word poet, Levi the Poet. I'm actually in this book. He has pictures with his fans in it, and I'm in it somewhere. I forget, because I've seen him a couple times live. But if you like spoken word poetry, listen to Levi the Poet. He's really good. And then just finishing up with some textbooks. So Immunology. Hematology. Oncology, or cancer. And then cancer chemotherapy, immunotherapy, and biotherapy. And that's it. We are officially done with my bookshelves. I'm in an awkward position here, but thank you for watching. If you've watched the whole series, you've now seen every book that I own, except for the books I've bought since starting this series. So there's a haul coming. But thank you so much.